Today on the podcast, I'm excited to welcome Ben Zeisloft, a bold voice in America's pro-life movement. Known for his uncompromising abolitionist stance on abortion, Ben has been a relentless advocate for the unborn. A former columnist at the Daily Wire, he brings a sharp insight and conviction to every conversation. He is the author of a new book, Forsakers of The Fatherless, which is scheduled to come out in August of this year. Today, we discuss abortion, the Trump administration, and why men in particular are called to the fight to end abortion. You're listening to the Great Reassessment Podcast. It's time to reassess. Ben Zeisloft, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Great to be here. Likewise.
So, I came across you on Twitter for the first time just before the presidential election back in November. And I don't know if you want to call it a Twitter war, but you came out and basically said that you were not going to vote for Donald Trump based on his policy position on abortion. And yeah, there was people on both sides, but that's sort of one of the issues that you talk about a lot is abortion. And the word abolitionist, which everyone is familiar with that word from, in history, how it was used during slavery and things like that. But now it's used in the context of abortion. And so could you describe your position on abortion and what abolitionism is as it relates to abortion?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. Abolitionism is basically the idea that abortion is a national sin that needs to be repented of immediately and without compromise. So for the past 50 years in the United States, we've had the pro-life movement, the pro-life establishment, trying to basically end abortion in a gradual, incremental way. So doing things like passing heartbeat bills, regulating the size of abortion clinics or their hallways, passing bills that say you have to give a baby a proper burial after you murder it. So basically all these various regulations and restrictions that try to chip away at abortion, make abortion less convenient, things like that, but ultimately allowing for the continued legal murder of babies. So the abolition position is essentially that we should treat babies in the womb as what they are, which is human beings made in God's image, equal in value to everybody who's outside the womb. So our efforts legislatively look like equal protection. So applying the same laws that protect you and me from homicide, assault, wrongful death, to babies who are inside the womb. So basically just recognizing, because there's equal value, image bearers of God, there needs to be equal protection and equal justice. So that's the abolition position in a nutshell. There's more that goes into that. There's definitely a lot of distinctions between that and the mainstream pro-life movement, and my book gets into some of that. But that's the abolitionism in a nutshell, yes.
Okay. Yeah. And how did you become so passionate about the abortion issue?
Yeah, so I, like most people, I grew up evangelical, pretty pro-life culturally. My parents are believers, they're pro-life. So I always knew that abortion was bad and that Christians don't support abortion. I knew that babies are precious before they're born, just like when they're after. For me, it really changed. So when I got to college, I would say that was when I was converted. I grew up, like I said, evangelical, going to a mega church kind of environment, but my faith really became my own freshman year of college. And those same older upperclassmen friends who led me to faith were also active in abortion mill ministry in Philadelphia. So they took me to the Planned Parenthood in Center City, Philadelphia, and there's another abortion mill more in Chinatown area that is actually the busiest in the entire state. They murder 6,500 babies every single year. So seeing mothers and fathers go into abortion mills to kill their babies under cover of law, like with my own eyes, was what really did it for me, right? You don't really... You can't really walk that off. You can't just see that and be unchanged. And on one occasion, I got to hold a baby that was saved through our ministry. That was a life-changing experience too, because that put flesh and bones on it. That was a little child who's 5 years old now, who was scheduled to die one morning at Planned Parenthood, and who is now alive because Christians were there, trying to obey God, sharing the gospel. And we got to his dad, and his dad ran in and got his mom out. So that is what put flesh and blood on that issue for me. So I've tried to labor, whether part-time or full-time, to end abortion in America and here in Pennsylvania.
That's really cool. People listening to this podcast, especially if they disagree, they might say, what do two men talking about abortion, right? And it's funny because ironically, all of a sudden we know what a woman is again.
Right.
And so I'll just point that out. But your book is called The Forsakers of the Fatherless. And so why should men particularly care about abortion? Because a lot of women will say, oh, our body, our choice. And a lot of passive men might say, okay, sure, yeah, it's your guys' issue. But why do men need to care about this?
Right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the title of the book because it's based on Psalm 68:5, which says that God is father to the fatherless and protector of widows in his holy habitation. So that's God himself saying that he's the one who protects fatherless children, who protects widows. So you see this consistent theme throughout the prophets in the Old Testament and, of course, the New Testament with our Lord Jesus of protecting widows, orphans, those who are less privileged, more vulnerable to legal discrimination, things like that. And that develops over 2,000 years of Christian history into things like knighthood and these distinctly masculine expressions of, protecting the innocent and the weak by using force, by using power that God gave us as men, um, for good, right? For His glory and against evildoers. Even Romans 13 articulates that standard of, the state exists in order to punish evildoers with the sword. It's actually a ministry of love in a sense because, defending the innocent, those who are oppressed under the law. That's a good thing to do. It doesn't seem like love at first, but it absolutely is. So to your question of, can men be involved in the abortion issue? I would say men must be involved in the abortion issue because God is the one who God gave us the distinct responsibility and ability to protect women and children. That's why we have bigger physical constitutions. That's why God put us in charge of the family, the states, and the church is because we have this distinct role, like our father Adam, of being priests and guardians over the sanctum, the sanctuary, on behalf of those who are under us. So it's not that men are more valuable than women inherently, or we're equal in value, but we have the distinct role of leadership and dominion, and sometimes it expresses itself as defending against evil, and abortion is a perfect example of that in our day.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's worth pointing out that a lot of women seek abortions because they don't have the father is not involved. And so maybe if he was, they wouldn't go down that road. Yeah, it's a difficult thing to talk about, but it's still very much necessary. Um, so why did you not vote for Donald Trump? I know you've probably answered this 100 times on a bunch of other podcasts, but just in case there's anybody out there, what was it ultimately? Because you sound like a conservative, you sound like a Christian, and when you're looking between Kamala Harris and President Trump, it seems like obvious that there's one road that leads us more down the further down the road of secularism, transgenderism, a outright celebration of the LGBTQIA plus 2SL agenda, and one side that is at least slowing the bleeding. So can you walk through what your convictions were at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Trump distinguished himself from 2016, 2020 in that he severely compromised on the pro-life issue. So, he was always vaguely pro-life, like most Republicans who run at the national level are. Mitt Romney, George W. Bush will usually say something about opposing abortion, maybe with exceptions for rape and incest, things like that. Trump had done sort of the same thing in previous elections, but this is sort of unprecedented, where he basically said, and he's kept that promise so far with things like the abortion pill, that he would basically leave abortion completely alone at the federal level. So that, like going back to Romans 13, I see that as putting aside the sword of justice that God has called him to wield, and basically abdicating his duty in a very explicit way. And I think that was a leftward shift that proved to be dangerous for the Republican Party because now we're losing our voice on the abortion issue, and talking to friends who are from Canada and the UK and nations like that. That was sort of the same pattern that their national conservative parties took as well on the abortion issue, was saying, looking at it pragmatically and saying we can build a bigger coalition, a bigger tent, if we just compromise on this, downplay our convictions on this. And yet, over a few decades later, both parties fully in support of abortion, with no exceptions and things of that nature. So I'm seeing that happening with the Republican Party, and that's why I took the stand that I did in 2024, and others did too, saying, we can't lose the Republican Party's witness on abortion. It's not it's not the Christian party. Certainly, it's not perfectly Christian or anything close to it. But that's historically been the party in which Christians have had a political home and have used that platform to advocate for things like opposing abortion, opposing homosexuality, and the GOP is shifting left or right on those issues. And I saw, evangelicals have political power. We just don't use it. We sort of take our power for granted. There's tens of millions of us, and we could throw around our weight a lot more at the national level and at the state level, especially if we just only used it and didn't just vote for whatever Republican was running. So I didn't vote for Trump or Harris, to be clear. I definitely didn't vote for Harris. I agree with you. Trump was the clear better option of the two, but I think he sort of disqualified himself for some of those reasons.
Sure. So I am I've been against abortion for a really long time. And, just with every fiber in my body, it breaks my heart that over 1 million babies are killed every year. That being said, how do you solve it? There's people who have different methods for many different ways on how they think they can achieve this end. You have incrementalists, you got the typical pro-life movement, which I've volunteered with and been a part of for a while, and then you sort of have this newer abolitionism, which is gaining in popularity. My question for you is, do you think the Constitution of the United States affords the federal government to completely outlaw abortion? Because Trump says that he thinks it belongs to the states, and I'm somebody who subscribes to the compact theory of the Constitution, not like this national idea that we are 50 sovereigns is my belief, and I think that's the historical consensus. So, who's to say, like, if they passed a national abortion ban 4 years later, they might as well just give it up. But do you at the core level, do you think that the Constitution allows for the government to do this, or should it be 50 individual state constitutional amendments?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I think ideally it would be all 50 states doing it, right? So if I murder somebody in the state of Pennsylvania, it's very unlikely that I'll go to federal prison or be tried in federal court. I'll probably go to state prison. I'll probably be tried in a state court. And I think that's how it should be. I think most things should be in our handle at the state level. That's part of our federal system. However, we've decided as a nation that we have the 14th Amendment. We have to have equal protection of the laws for our citizens, and we fought a civil war over that. That resulted in that outcome, and there's a lot of complexities with that, as you know. But I think as a magistrate, who swears his oath to the Constitution, that happens at the state level, but also at the president, of course, swears an oath to the Constitution to protect and defend the Constitution. So in order to uphold that oath, I think he or she, well, thankfully so far he, has to make sure that the 14th Amendment is being enforced by the states. So I don't know if there's a clear-cut answer to how to do that. I definitely wouldn't prefer a national abortion ban. I prefer the states to just treat abortion as murder. But in sort of a less than ideal scenario where you have a lot of states who are going to have abortion anyway and have no interest in banning it, I think if Trump today said we're gonna push forward a national abortion ban, I would completely support that. I think it's not ideal, but it's the best. I think he's completely within his rights to do that. There's other things that he could be doing on the abortion pill right now that he's not. He's actually defending, the DOJ is defending the continued legal access to the abortion pill by which 2/3 of babies are murdered in America right now. So even beyond just the question of a national ban, because that's brought up a lot, there's more that he could be doing even beyond, getting a bill like that through Congress and all the controversy that would cause. There's basic federal executive actions he could be taking, and then he's taken on other issues, but he's because he campaigned on this, he's choosing to not take those same actions on child sacrifice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's complex, but I agree. I think 50 individual states constitutional amendments is the way to go, and that sort of I agree. I believe that's the case with most laws, that everything should be handled on that level, because we've seen that when things get past the national level, like it's been forever since we've passed a national constitutional amendment. It's almost impossible to do at this point, especially with the division. And so, so who in the national spotlight do you think is tackling this issue from a lawmaking perspective the right way?
It's a good question. I think most of the exciting action is happening on the state level. So I'm the communications director for the Foundation to Abolish Abortion. So that's a new role that I've assumed in the past month or so. So we contend for equal protection in the state legislatures. We had over a dozen bills across the country this year. We had several dozen lawmakers. We'll come out with the exact number soon, but several dozen lawmakers who sign on to those bills across the country. There are certain states where a quarter of the entire GOP caucus in either the House or the Senate were signing on to our bills. So there's a lot of exciting movement, and there's a handful of really exciting bill champions across the country who are basically emerged as contenders for the abolition of abortion. So think of guys like Dusty Devers, who wrote the foreword to my book, a state senator in Oklahoma, Christian pastor. There's a guy named Brent Money in Texas who's also a really fierce advocate for abolition. And there's been guys over the past decade and a half or so of the abolition movement who've filled that kind of a role of showing what could be done by a man who decides to run for his state legislature and defend the preborn. There's less at the federal level. There's some senators and lawmakers who are better than others on this issue at the federal level, but I think the really encouraging stuff is happening in the states.
Yeah. So I want to make this practical for anybody listening. And teenagers, it's hard to get them to care about anything, and sometimes they feel like a lot of these things are so far removed from them. But what would your message be to young people on abortion? And if you had to try to change their mind, I guess, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the Christian teenager, who maybe like me grew up in a Christian home, or generally just knows that abortion is bad but hasn't really thought through it. I think you, of course, can read your Bible, become more sanctified, study the heart of God in this matter. But also, I think really the benefit of being young is you can get into the fight. So especially as men, we have that urge to get into the fights and to actually do things rather than just talk about things, or at least we should. So doing things like, public evangelism on a college campus, going to an abortion mill for abortion mill ministry, doing those sorts of things will put hands and feet on the issue and help you to understand, what exactly is going on. So I didn't know that, of course I knew abortion was bad for most of my life, but like I said, it wasn't until I actually went and watched babies being murdered that I got motivated to actually do something about it. So that would be, I think, a really good first step for like the Christian teenage, maybe college-aged young person is find a way to get tangibly involved in the issue instead of just holding the right opinions in your head, right? So I think oftentimes as Christians, our temptation is to just have the right ideas about things or have good theology. But nobody can really see what's going on in your head. The way that you prove that is with your mouth, with your hands, with your feet, with what you actually do in the world. So bearing good fruit and keeping with repentance, bearing good fruit for God, looks a lot like actually doing things. It's hard to just, of course, God wants our minds to be sanctified, our hearts to be sanctified, for our posture toward Him to be correct. But a big part of that is service, is actually going and loving our neighbors as ourselves, that second great commandment.
Yeah, I noticed the way you talk about abortion, you don't really ever sever it. It's always tethered to your Christian worldview. Do you think why is that necessary? Because right now, like in a lot of pro-life movements, right, they might be Christian at the root, but it almost feels like sometimes they're catering to a nominally Christian world, and so they're always sort of pulling their punches theologically, or their arguments, because they're trying to cast a wide net, right? They want everybody in the fight as much as possible, but it almost seems like there's some weaknesses in that, because you pull in people who are not theologically grounded in something, because to the point where it can be sustained over a long period of time. And so is that intentional on your part, not to untether your fight against abortion from your Christian worldview? Because you might be missing out on collaborating with people who maybe share your views against abortion, but maybe not quite as strong on like the Christian belief side.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. My boss, Bradley Pierce, the president of the Foundation to Abolish Abortion, says it best, where he compares it to children on the playground, where the question is who says, right? Who says we have to go inside? Who says recess is over? So we all know that there has to be an authority, right? So we can know true things about the world. We can read the book of nature. We can understand science and philosophy on the issue of life. Nature screams that witness. You can look right now with ultrasound technology. You can look inside the womb and you can hear heartbeats and you can see the body parts forming. And if you go to the doctor, he or she can tell you, there's a foot. Here's the sex of the baby. We have unprecedented light from nature in terms of what is actually happening in the womb, and yet we're as darkened as we've ever been, as brazen as we've ever been toward life in the womb, much more than past generations that didn't even have that technology. So it can't merely stop at the light of nature; it has to go into the light of special revelation as well as natural. It matters who says we can't murder. You're getting to the point where most pro-choice activists are saying we know it's murder. It's just the woman's rights outweigh the rights of the baby, and it's getting more and more honest to that effect. But I think that's where Christians need to step in and say, well, ultimately we orient all this around what God says, His revelation. And the reason why abortion is wrong is the reason why every other murder is wrong. It's because God says so. We're made in God's image. We know that from Scripture, from His spoken word that has now been written for us. So there's really no getting around it. I agree. There are atheists and people who aren't Christians who don't like abortion or will call themselves pro-life, but you can't really build an entire nation around that actually values life. You need something like, actually, you need specifically Christianity. It can't just be something like Christianity. It has to be the author of life, because He alone brings life where there is once death. And for our culture especially, that has been apostatizing, our one shot of getting back to that value is going back to that author of life and honoring His image once more.
Yeah. And what is your response to the criticism where people might say, look, abolitionism doesn't actually save more babies' lives, or at least it doesn't save as many as incrementalism or pro-life, or making there be more inconveniences. Do you agree with that?
I'm not going to say that no incremental bill has ever saved a baby, right? I would just say that, so states that have heartbeat bans and things of that nature, I think they've probably saved some babies. I'm never going to doubt that, but I would doubt that it's saving as many babies as people think they are, because again, it's just a regulation on abortion. It's just saying, here's a time period, here's a type of baby you can't murder. Just go around this and you can still legally commit a murder. And this comes up a lot, like last year with Lindsey Graham and the 15-week ban, his 15-week federal ban. It sounded really good because babies are gestating for 40 weeks. 15 weeks is the first trimester, so that sounds pretty good. You're protecting babies in the second and third trimester. But what people were missing was that 94% of abortions happen in the first trimester. So with the abortion pill, you have to do it, I believe it's in the first 12 weeks, and that's now 2/3 of abortions in the United States. So a lot of the time we get kind of played by the pro-life establishment, where Christians who sincerely want to end abortion, gain ground on ending abortion, will look at something like a heartbeat bill that's touted by a pro-life group and celebrate and want to celebrate because we want to see babies getting saved. But what we're not being told is that they're not nearly as effective as we think they are. So that's the more practical reality on the ground. But I think one of the reasons why we've had legal abortions for the past half century has been the lack of a clear prophetic witness from Christians saying, no, we can't regulate abortion. God has told us that abortion is sin, therefore we need to nationally repent of that sin. And I think that's actually how we truly not just kind of chip away at ending abortion, but actually finally abolish it in our country, is we obey God and we say we're going to protect babies under the sixth commandment, which is you shall not murder, apply the laws against murder to them and their lives. And that's how you truly bring about the end of it. And I can look to 65 million reasons why the pro-life incrementalist strategy is a proven failure, right? Because, of course, there's been 65 million babies murdered over the past half century. And I think a lot of those Christians were well-intentioned, but I think ultimately we have to reform this movement and go back to Scripture on it and say, it's time to abolish abortion as God commands, not just because we're doing what's right in our own eyes or what we think is most politically expedient, but the duty is ours to obey Him, and the results belong to Him.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. So when you look at society right now, or right now, one of the biggest right now, one of the topics of conversation in the country and around the world really is population collapse. And I think it's a little interesting that people are actually starting to wake up to this. They're worried about it, and trying to incentivize people to have babies all across the world by offering tax incentives, and Trump's even talked about a baby bonus. And the obvious answer seems like if you want to people to start having babies, why not stop aborting them? So, what are your thoughts on baby bonuses and how that relates to abortion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that abortion is just the most dramatic fruit of a culture that just hates children. That's selfish. So the a predominant reason why there's a ton of reasons we can talk all day about that. As to why people aren't having children, I think a big one is selfishness. Is saying, I want my own comfort. I prioritize that over a baby, and I see a baby as an obstacle to that comfort. I think that's what drives a lot of abortions in the United States. Um, and I hear all the time from moms and dads outside the abortion mills in Philadelphia is saying, I just don't want to be a mom right now. I'm not ready for it. It's inconvenient for me. I want to keep working, whatever the case may be. Um, so I think that goes into the active murder of children, but also the preventing of having children in the first place. There's a lot of that kind of mindset of, I just want to serve myself. I see a child as an obstacle to that, and therefore I'm not going to have babies. I think that's so. It's really a broad spectrum of issues, and I think we preach the gospel to the entire culture because, like I was saying, God is the one who brings life, and His gospel is the word of life. So one of the fruits of Christian cultures is a love for children and babies, and if we're going to have that again, we need to go back to the God who makes children in His own image. Because if we love Him, we'll love His image bearers, even the smallest ones.
Yeah. Kind of want to switch gears here. Moving away from like the abortion issue, where do you see, so if you look around at culture, Christianity, conservatism, in what ways do you think any progress has been made? Are you as you look around the country, where are you encouraged? And then maybe you could also share, where are you cautiously optimistic?
Sure, yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic about our generation of young men who are seeing the fruits of things like feminism playing out in their own lives, and making it a lot harder to find a good woman or to buy a home and things of that nature. And we're almost the vanguard of seeing the fruit of how destructive and corrosive that is to civilization. And that's why you see so many young men. I think that's a large part of it going back to Christianity. So in Gen Z, of course, it's largely liberal, but you're starting to see in the election 2024 and maybe beyond, especially with young men. There's a certain percentage of young men who are very, very right wing, and who are going back to Christianity and tradition and trying to dig back into history. So I'm cautiously optimistic about that, and I hope it turns into a real gospel movement. And I think in many ways it is. But sort of being uprooted all the time and being deracinated, it makes this it gives you this desire to actually go back and understand where we came from. So, like I mentioned earlier, I grew up evangelical, megachurch, that sort of a upbringing. So when I got to college, I started going to a PCA, very traditional PCA church in Philadelphia, and it was a culture shock for me at first, but as I started growing in my faith, I started to appreciate it because it was actually rooted in something. It wasn't just, we built an amphitheater because we can, and that's the way that churches are built nowadays. But we're building like churches have always been built, with certain structures, and we respect theologians through the ages. We'll quote them in our sermons. We'll do book studies about them, as well as, of course, getting into the Bible and historic doctrine. But having that rootedness does really wonders for the soul in a lot of ways, because you're not, just this aimless atom floating around in space, but you know where you come from and where you're going. And for the Christian, that's especially true.
Yeah, I think I'm cautious. I think I'm optimistic with how many families are pulling their kids out of public schools and deciding to homeschool them. Because kind of like what you talked about, like there's been a huge, like, millennials and Gen Zers have, like you said, like the word you used, deracinated. Like there's nothing that's sort of tethering them to like their own story.
Right.
And the message of the last 20 years has been how America's a terrible racist country and we have nothing to be proud of, and your family doesn't matter. They've waged the war on the family, but that's largely happened when the kids have been separated from their parents. And I think people are sort of waking up that families need to be together, right? Um, And so this renewed fascination with families and spending time together, and it's just that's sort of what's really encouraging to me, is that maybe the strength of the family in this country can sort of take on a new robustness. And people are, I think, getting into church again and going back to Christian principles. And it's hard to say like how much of that is absolutely completely genuine or just a fad, but I guess we'll see when the dust sort of settles. It does seem like a lot of the optimism that was in the air, like in December and January after Trump won, has sort of tapered off a little bit, but maybe that's just how it goes a little bit. There's ebbs and flows.
Right, that's our
Um,
temptation usually with national politics. I think conservatives really fall into this trap even more than progressives do. Is we do something like we win the White House, and then for 4 years, all right, go back to sleep, and
mm,
then 4 years later, you wake back up when there's another presidential national election,
yeah.
and nothing's been done on the state or local level, and now you're worse off than when you began. So that's my great fear in this moment right now. We're about 5 or 6 months into Trump's second term, and I think a lot of people are going back to sleep. So we need to make sure that the message is clear. This is not a permanent fix. This is just a reprieve. To not have the federal beast breathing down our necks, to not be threatened with arrest if you want to do something like go and pray outside of an abortion mill. But now is the time to build and to actually gain ground beyond that cover that's kind of been put over us for a little bit.
Yeah, like I always say, this is the worst time to take your foot off the gas,
Yes.
and it can be tough. All this, prices are rising, all the talks about tariffs and everything, and sometimes it's just easier to check out. But we need people who stay in the political arena to keep fighting for this, and just don't stop now, I guess.
Right.
So you used to work for the Daily Wire. I'm kind of curious about that. How long did you work there, and what was one of your big takeaways that you from your experience?
Sure. So I started as an intern in the summer of 2021 when I was in college. And then my senior year of college, I worked part time just on the side, writing some articles, and then full time for 1 year after college. So I was predominantly a business and economics reporter. So, sort of had a beat in those areas, covered a lot of like corporate wokeness stories, things of that nature, as well as just general economics news, business news as it came up. But I enjoyed the experience. And, the Daily Wire gets a lot of bad press nowadays, but there's a lot of good folks who are still there, believers. Megan Basham is a good example. She, of course, has done a lot of reporting on evangelicalism and corruption in sort of left wing, big Eva evangelicalism. And there's some guys behind the scenes too, reporters and others who work there who are excellent Christians, men and women of conviction. So, you know, uh, they get a bad rap in the press, and but I think there's still a lot of there's a lot of good there for sure.
Yeah. How did that shape you as a person?
Yeah, that's good. I hadn't thought about that question, but well, first job out of college, so it's sort of a long story, but I wasn't actually sure I'd be offered a job coming out of college. So at that time, end of my senior year, I was about to get married. I was figuring out where to live, and it's a few weeks out from graduation. I didn't really have a firm job, and I accepted another job that wasn't really that ideal for me. And then at the time, their then managing editor called me and said, "Hey, we want you to stay on." So that was a really cool providential moment in my life of just massive blessing from God, and a sign that He would provide. So that's a big lesson I remember from those days. But in general, it's just really good as a writer. One of the best things you can do to improve in your writing is just writing a lot. So working full time as a reporter really did help me to hone those abilities, whether it was op-eds or mostly news, but also some other sorts of writing. That was really beneficial to me on a professional level too.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, they're sort of like the biggest conservative alternative network. I know
Yeah.
some of the criticisms I've been seeing pop up online right now is, they claim to be conservative, yet, you know, people are sort of reviewing a lot of the previous tapes of Ben Shapiro and, some of those things. Like, is it really conservative if they're really soft on the gay marriage issue?
Right.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, they had Jordan Peterson interviewing Dave Rubin about him buying children with his quote unquote husband. They had, there's a lot of compromise there on those sorts of issues for sure. They've been very friendly toward it. I think Jeremy Boring was one of the folks who congratulated Dave Rubin when they did that. So that's it's emblematic of a broader rot in evangelicalism, or rather in like Christless conservatism. Let's say,
Mhm.
um, not all those guys obviously would call themselves evangelical, but yeah, there's that sort of Big Tent mentality, and I think it causes a lot of people who don't actually have conservative principles to compromise on them pretty readily because they don't see them as important. And then conservatism just sort of loses its distinctness because now it's just pro Donald Trump or Republican or like anti woke, and it doesn't actually have principles that it tries to advance actively. It just kind of preserves the leftist victory from 5 years ago. And that's been a big critique of conservatism in general for as long as that term has existed. Is really it doesn't forward anything. It's more reactionary. It just kind of defends what it sees as a moment in time it wants to freeze. So maybe with a lot of guys like, your Jordan Petersons or your James Lindsay's, right, who's an atheist who claims to be, or is tries to edge in on conservative circles. They probably just want to go back to like the '90s, like the liberalism of the '90s, and I think Christians want to go back to. Go back in a sense to like an older, more timeless standard of like a Christendom, a civilization based on Christian principles, but also move forward with that. So not merely just have go back to 16th century Germany or 17th century Geneva, but really take those exact principles that those timeless truths, those old paths, like Jeremiah 6 says, and apply them in our day to things like AI and the exciting things in our future. But I think conservatism doesn't really have that big of a vision, and it gets sidetracked into various distractions, and doesn't really have much to stand on.
Yeah, it makes you really, I mean, it should be a lesson for all of us to really be careful who you lock arms with in a cultural fight or any sort of battle, I guess, because it's really hard when you've befriended somebody and now all of a sudden, years down the road, something in their life is sort of the spotlight for a national issue. And I imagine it's probably really hard for Ben Shapiro and Dave, like to, even if he fundamentally disagrees, but you're so you've developed such a relationship at this point where you're sort of trapped, and now you have to compromise on issues like this for the sake of your company, and that's not a really good place to be operating because it should be your principles at the forefront. And now I think we're in an age where people are really good at detecting any sort of inconsistency.
Yeah.
People are really good at that. We've been trained over that, like the last 5 years, and these double standards and all that. And I wouldn't be surprised if pretty much any Christian, they lost their support. And so, yeah, that's tough. I wouldn't want to be in their shoes by any stretch of the imagination. So you wrote about business and economics, uh, and you DM'd me like how if I would bring up Bitcoin or how much are we going to talk about Bitcoin. And I just want to know, like, what are your thoughts about Bitcoin?
Sure. Yeah, Bitcoin is not something I'm super familiar with, to be quite honest. I know the general, I guess, contours of it, but my skepticism toward it is, if it's supposed to be treated like a currency, I don't see it as actually behaving as a currency. It's not a medium of exchange. It's not a store of value. Nobody really uses it in those ways. It's more just an investment product. It is how at least it reads to me from a distance. So I've owned various cryptocurrency through platforms like Coinbase. I know that you don't actually own your cryptocurrency if you have it through a platform like that. I think crises like FTX kind of show that. So after that, I actually sold a lot of my cryptocurrency. Didn't have that much, maybe just a couple $100. But I'm more of the mindset of like gold, silver, more precious metals as sort of a long term historic store of value. So I told a friend of mine one time I kind of view it as God's Bitcoin, right? Because it has like this fixed supply on the earth, and doesn't really it fluctuates here and there just on the markets, but the actual value of it doesn't really change because the government just jacks up the prices or prints more gold. You can't really print more gold unless you're an alchemist of some sort. So that's my approach toward the issue, but I'm happy to have pushback or be corrected.
No, I like gold, and I try to tell people that. I think a lot of people think that if you're a Bitcoiner, you automatically like hate gold. And I mean, I think gold is great. I think any commodity money is is good, and there's a use case for it. Bitcoin is unique in the sense that like gold has relative scarcity. We really don't know how much gold is in the earth. And, where was it? I think somewhere in China, they just discovered a really big mine, a gold mine recently. So it's constantly being discovered. But with Bitcoin, you do have absolute scarcity. You have 21 million Bitcoin. There will never be more than that. And when you have that type of scarcity, it protects you from the things like money printing. Like the government cannot print more of it no matter how much they want to. They're not going to be able to control it. And you know, where gold has weaknesses is like if you had to go from A to B, it's really hard to take all your gold with you. But with Bitcoin, your entire savings, all of your wealth can go with you in your mind. Because if you can memorize 12 to 24 word seed phrase, you can get on one plane and you can go somewhere on the other side of the earth. And so long as you have those words and you have an internet access, you can have everything restored to you. And we know in the past the government has seized gold from its citizens. It's happened in the United States. It's happened in a bunch of other countries. The what the government did in 1933 with Executive Order 6102. What they did was because the dollar was pegged to gold back then, and they seized everyone's gold, and then they actually increased the rate after they had it and allowed themselves to spend more money. And so gold can be manipulated to some degree. It can be confiscated. And there's been a ton of instances where you have gold bricks, but there's really just tungsten on the inside and it's just gold plated and people are sold fake things like that. And then I guess, I do think it will eventually become a widely used medium of exchange. It's a medium of exchange for those who use it. I've purchased things in Bitcoin before, and I think it's a store of value if you hold it long enough. Nobody who's held Bitcoin for 4 years is down on their savings. And so, you have that. But then probably the most interesting aspect for me is like the permissionless nature of it.
Yeah,
You know,
certainly.
you don't need anyone's permission to buy or sell. Um, you don't need anyone's permission to support a cause. During the Canadian trucker protest a few years ago, the only type of money that they weren't able to seize was the Bitcoin. And so I think it's a force for freedom, and it's really one of the only things that can unshackle us from the corrupt monetary regimes around the world that seek to exploit us. Because I make more money today than I did 5 years ago, but if you adjust for inflation, I'm actually making less. And
Right.
I think most people, like your average Joe, probably if you went and did the calculation, it would probably be the same. And so, yeah. But I'm always just curious to pick people's brains. I'm not out here to change anyone's mind. I just like to learn from people. And so,
Yeah, and absolutely, I agree that it's the most compelling use case, especially in this juncture of world
yeah.
history, is these totalitarian governments. And as you see things like modern monetary theory start to gain traction, it's like, yeah, cash is less and less alluring by the day. It never really was, especially since the gold standard went away. But so that's sort of the same thing that's driven me into more interest in precious metals, things of that nature. Is wanting some kind of a hedge against how bad the monetary system is. But I think that's the most compelling case. I agree with Bitcoin is the borderless nature, and it's much harder to be tyrannized with it.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So, just as we wrap up here, so your book comes out in August 2025, and I will put, links for the pre-order down in the show notes. What can people expect, and who did you write the book for? Like who is in your mind, like your audience as you're writing this book?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. So yeah, so it's available in August 2025 is when it will ship, and then it's available for pre-order right now. So if folks want to go to Founders Ministries websites, they can pre-order it. But I wrote the book for like the Christian who wants to end abortion. So it's sort of a broad audience. So I didn't try to pigeonhole it into like an apologetic for the abolitionist movement. So Dusty Devers in his foreword does argue explicitly for abolitionism. He lays out the 5 tenets of abolitionism. It's an acronym called GATES that some guys have articulated. But the rest of the book is really journalism, history. It's showing, like this 15 year stretch of Christians trying to end abortion in the various states. and being opposed by none other than the pro-life groups, the pro-life establishment. So the groups they thought were there to end abortion are actually there to oppose them from and stop them from ending abortion. The reasons for that are numerous. A lot of them are just they play five-dimensional political chess, and some are devoted to the second victim narrative, saying that women are always victims of abortion, therefore equal protection legislation, which just says anybody who murders anybody else gets penalized for that murder. They would oppose on those grounds. But yeah, really the book is for the Christian who wants to go into their states and work with whatever talents God has given them, whether that's politically or culturally, to end abortion, to understand that they may not just be opposed by the pro-choicers. They may not be opposed by Planned Parenthood, especially in more red states, swing states where the GOP or the pro-life establishment has power. They might actually find themselves opposed by those sorts of groups, and even groups that we would all recognize as big players in the anti-abortion world, or that we give money to, or our grandmothers write their fixed income checks to. Those are the sorts of groups that are actually in many cases opposing the end of abortion in the United States. So I think it's a reality that needs to be exposed journalistically, and Christians need to be warned about it as they go and fight.
Yeah. Yeah, as you said something that made me think of a question. I think when people hear abolitionists, sometimes they think that their approach is too harsh or too brash, and whereas others are not. But would you agree, and would most abolitionists agree, that there are varying degrees of culpability if somebody conducts an abortion? For example, not a lot of women are rightly educated on what they're getting themselves into. Sometimes they're manipulated into getting it. Sometimes a doctor might, and I hesitate to even call them a doctor if they're performing an abortion, but the medical provider sort of manipulating them into getting it. Are there graces within abolitionism for a woman who is, I don't want to say completely ignorant, but somewhat ignorant and is manipulated into getting an abortion?
Oh, certainly, yeah. So equal protection legislation, like the Foundation to Abolish Abortion promotes, we don't. It doesn't actually prescribe a specific penalty in every single case where an abortion happens. It just says apply the existing homicide and assault and wrongful death codes to this case. So when there's an abortion that happens, I agree with you. A number of factors could be at play. It could range all the way from the mother who, shouts for abortion and brags about having 5 abortions previously. Now it's number 6, to the 14-year-old girl who's dragged there by her mother. And then all sorts of cases in between where there's various pressures, coercion at play, true coercion, not just, I feel like I can't do it kind of thing, but actual coercion from like a boyfriend or a parent or something. But the reason we have a legal system is to sort all those things out. So just like in any other murder case, there's premeditation, there's the certain state of mind the person's in. But the juries and the judges and the prosecutors are there to figure out those things out. And there's checks and there's due process and checks and balances to make sure that people's rights aren't being trampled. So all we're saying is apply those pre-existent homicide statutes, that justice system, to also protect the preborn baby, because right now it's just open season on babies. So as long as the baby is inside the womb, in most of the country, you can just kill them. It doesn't really matter. None of that even matters. Just for whatever reason, you have the right of life and death over your own preborn child. So we're just saying that's the injustice that needs to be corrected. But I completely agree with you. It's not some vendetta against women. It's just the pro-life groups are actually the ones who raise that point. They're the ones who say no matter what, the woman is always the victim. And that's the mindset that I don't think is true most of the time. It's true some of the time. There are women who are victims of abortion. I don't deny that. But we have a legal system and a court system to determine who is a victim and who is a perpetrator.
Yeah, I think that's well put. Well, Ben, I think we can just kind of wrap things up. I just really want to thank you for your time and thank you for the work that you're doing. Where can people sort of learn more and just follow you or support the work that you do?
Absolutely. So you can follow me on X. My tag is at Ben Zeisloft. You can follow the Foundation to Abolish Abortion. It's just right in my bio on X. We have a 6-part docuseries called Abortion Free as well. So it sort of details the post-Roe landscape for abortion and how to actually end it at this point in our history. And of course, buy the book. So I forgot to mention earlier, but Founders Ministries has a discount code, Forsakers, so just the first word of the title. When you go to check out, it's 10% off the book. And there's also volume discounts and things of that nature too. So you can follow up on all those places, I suppose.
Great. Well, look forward to reading that. And yeah, I'll put all that in the show notes. And, just best of luck with what you're doing. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. And just thank you for your time today, man.
Likewise. Yeah, thank you very much.
Have a good one.